Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the mailbox was full of letters that didn't belong. Some were addressed to no one in particular, just the house number and street, but no one seemed to mind. I sorted the envelopes without opening them, stacking them neatly on the counter where the morning sun never reached. The absence of return addresses didn't seem strange, not after so many weeks. I watered the plants. The soil was always damp, though I couldn't recall the last time it hadn't rained. Later, I wiped the kitchen table, streaks of dust marking patterns I didn't recognize. As I glanced at the clock, which ticked each second evenly, I left the back door unlatched just in case. The letters are still there now. I count them sometimes when sleep won't come, my fingers tracing the edges of each envelope, 23 today. There were 17 yesterday, but memory plays tricks in houses like this one, where shadows shift without the sun moving and floorboards settle in rhythms that match no footstep I've ever heard. I suppose it began with the woman who lived here before me, or perhaps it began when I decided to stay, to make this place mine despite the peculiarities that came with the deed. The realtor had mentioned nothing about mail delivery irregularities, though she did pause when showing me the kitchen, her hand hovering over the counter where I now stacked the mysterious correspondence. The woman before me had been solitary, they said, a collector of things that didn't belong to her, books with other people's names inscribed inside covers, photographs of families she'd never met, keys to doors that no longer existed. When her belongings were cleared out, boxes and boxes of items that told no coherent story, the house seemed to exhale with relief, but some habits I've learned outlived their creators. I remember the first envelope that made me pause. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind that suggests someone took time to form each letter perfectly. No name, just the address, but something about the ink seemed familiar. I held it up to the window, trying to see through the paper without opening what wasn't mine. The silhouette of folded pages, dense with text, made me wonder who writes letters anymore and why they would send them here. The back door latch clicks sometimes in the wind. I oil it regularly, but the mechanism seems to loosen itself, as if the house prefers to remain accessible. The woman before me, I learned from neighbors who speak in careful whispers, had been found in the kitchen. Not dead, they assured me quickly, but gone in the way that matters. Her mind had wandered into territories from which it couldn't return, and she spoke only of visitors who came through doors that were never locked. I've started reading some of the letters, not opening them exactly, but several arrived with seals that had loosened in the damp air. The contents are fragments, pieces of conversations that assume context I don't possess, references to meetings that never happened, apologies for words that were never spoken, gratitude for kindnesses that exist only in the writer's memory. The kitchen table bears marks I didn't make, circular stains from cups I never placed there, scratches that form almost patterns in the wood. When I wiped the surface clean, these marks seemed to darken, becoming more pronounced rather than fading. The woman before me, I imagine, sat here reading her own mysterious mail, trying to piece together stories from fragments that made sense only to minds that had learned to fill in gaps with whatever felt true. Some letters are addressed to me, though they use a name that isn't mine. The handwriting varies, but the tone remains consistent, intimate, assuming a relationship that doesn't exist. They speak of shared experiences, inside jokes, moments of connection that live only on paper. I've begun to wonder if the woman before me had been writing to herself, creating correspondence that would outlive her presence in this house. The plants grow too quickly. I water them because they seem to expect it, but their leaves reach toward windows with an urgency that suggests they're trying to escape. The soil remains perpetually moist, dark and rich in a way that makes me think of things decomposing, transforming, becoming something other than what they once were. The woman before me had planted them. The neighbors told me, talking to them as if they could respond. I've started leaving some letters unopened on the counter, arranged in the same neat stack I found that first morning. The pattern feels important, though I can't explain why. The morning sun still doesn't reach that corner of the kitchen, and I've stopped trying to understand the logic of light in this house. Some spaces seem designed to remain in shadow, to hold secrets that illuminate only under specific conditions. The back door opens inward, which strikes me as unusual for an exterior entrance. When I leave it unlatched, I sometimes return to find it slightly ajar, though no wind seems strong enough to move it. The woman before me, according to the realtor's careful words, had believed someone was coming to visit. She prepared for arrivals that never materialized, setting extra places at the table, leaving doors unlocked, maintaining correspondence with people who existed only in the spaces between what was written and what was understood. I dream about the letters now. In sleep, I open envelope after envelope, reading words that rearrange themselves as my eyes move across the page. The handwriting shifts, becoming my own, though I don't remember writing anything. I wake to find my fingers stained with ink that washes away reluctantly, leaving traces under my nails that catch the light strangely. The woman before me had been a teacher, someone mentioned. She understood the importance of clear communication, of saying exactly what you meant. But clarity, I've learned, can be a burden when the world insists on remaining ambiguous. Maybe she began writing letters to create the conversations she couldn't have with anyone else, addressing them to a house that would hold them safely, indefinitely. I count the letters obsessively now. The number changes in ways that follow no pattern I can discern. Sometimes there are more in the evening than there were in the morning. Sometimes I find envelopes I don't remember sorting, placed in the stack with the same careful attention I give to the task. The woman before me, I think, had been counting too, trying to make sense of accumulation that exceeded explanation. The kitchen clock ticks with mechanical precision, but I've noticed that the rhythm doesn't match my heartbeat the way clocks usually do. It maintains its own tempo, indifferent to the biological rhythms of whoever happens to be listening. The woman before me had wound it daily, the neighbors said, though it's electric and requires no such maintenance. Some gestures persist beyond their practical purpose, becoming rituals that comfort through repetition rather than function. I've begun writing letters of my own, not responses to the ones I receive, but new correspondence addressed to no one in particular, just the house number and street. My handwriting has changed, becoming more careful, more deliberate. I write about the woman before me, though I never met her, creating a relationship that exists only in the space between memory and imagination. The back door latch grows looser each time I check it. I've stopped fighting this tendency, accepting that some mechanisms prefer their own adjustment. The woman before me understood this, I think. She learned to work with the house's preferences rather than against them, leaving doors unlatched not from carelessness, but from recognition that some spaces need to breathe. The letters continue arriving, though I never see who delivers them. The mailbox fills overnight, as if correspondence materializes from intention rather than postal service. I sort them in the morning, stacking them on the counter where shadows preserved their secrets. The woman before me had done this too, creating order from mystery, finding comfort in ritual even when understanding remained elusive. I water the plants, though their soil stays damp from sources I can't identify. The leaves whisper against windows when no wind stirs, and I've started listening for patterns in their movement. The woman before me had conversations with growing things, the neighbors said, speaking to them as if they held answers to questions she couldn't articulate. The dust on the kitchen table forms patterns that resist my cleaning efforts. I wipe the surface repeatedly, but the marks return, darker and more defined each time. The woman before me had traced these patterns with her finger, I imagine, reading meaning in accidental arrangements of household debris. As I glance at the clock, which maintains its independent rhythm, I understand that time moves differently in houses where mystery accumulates like dust. The woman before me had learned this too, existing in moments that stretched beyond their measured duration, finding infinity in the space between tick and tock. I leave the back door unlatched now, accepting what I once resisted. The woman before me knew that some visitors announced themselves not through arrival, but through the possibility of arrival, through doors left open to welcome what might never come but could always surprise us. The letters are still there now, stacked neatly on the counter where morning sun never reaches. I count them when sleep won't come, my fingers tracing edges that hold secrets I may never understand. 23 today, or perhaps 17, memory plays tricks in houses like this one, where the woman before me learned to find comfort in mysteries that resist solution, leaving doors unlatched just in case. Story 2. The evening sun seeped through the slats of the blinds, casting stripes across the worn rug. The ticking of the mantel clock matched the rhythm of my heartbeat as I stepped into the living room. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with something metallic. Everything appeared untouched, yet the bottom drawer of the credenza stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A chill edged up my spine as I leaned closer, the silence swallowing the room whole. I've been circling back to this moment for weeks now. The drawer, always the drawer. But before that, there was the morning when I found the coffee cup still warm on the kitchen counter, lipstick stain on the rim. Not my shade, never my shade. The house holds its breath differently now, creaks where it never creaked before, shadows that seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. I measure my steps across the hardwood floors, counting 17 paces from the front door to the kitchen. Always 17, except that one morning when it was 18. She used to hum while washing dishes, a tune I never recognized but grew to anticipate. The melody would drift through the hallway, wrapping around corners like smoke. Now the silence feels thick enough to cut. I found myself standing in the garage yesterday, staring at the oil stain on the concrete floor. Dark, irregular shape that resembles a bird in flight, or maybe spilled paint. I can't remember when it first appeared. These details matter now in ways they never did before. The neighbor across the street watches from her window. I see the curtain twitch when I check the mailbox. She has something to say but keeps it locked behind her teeth. Her garden grows wilder each day, roses climbing over the fence like they're trying to escape. There's a photograph missing from the hallway. I know because the wall shows a clean rectangle where dust settled around the frame. Family portrait, I think, or maybe just a landscape. The nail remains empty and accusatory. I've started keeping a journal, not of events exactly, but of feelings. The way the air tastes different on certain days, how my reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes appears to be looking over my shoulder, small betrayals of normalcy that accumulate like sediment. The phone rang at 3 in the morning last week. No one spoke when I answered, but I could hear breathing, measured, deliberate. I held the receiver against my ear until the dial tone returned, then checked every lock in the house twice. Memory plays tricks. I remember conversations that may never have happened, promises made in whispers, the sound of footsteps on the stairs when I was alone, or thought I was alone. The distinction matters less now. The coffee shop downtown closed without warning, windows papered over, chairs stacked upside down on tables. The barista with the crooked smile and careful hands simply vanished, along with the regular customers who gathered there every morning, sharing secrets over steam and caffeine. I found a key in my coat pocket, brass worn smooth by countless fingers. It doesn't fit any lock in this house. I've tried them all, twice. The metal grows warm when I hold it, as if it remembers being used recently. The credenza drawer holds nothing now, I've checked, but the wood bears impressions where something heavy once rested. Rectangular depressions in the felt lining like the ghost of a jewelry box, or documents, or something else entirely. Sleep comes in fragments. I wake to find windows open that I'm certain I closed, doors unlocked that I remember securing. The house breathes around me, expanding and contracting with temperature changes that feel too deliberate to be natural. There's a woman at the grocery store who nods when she sees me, recognition without introduction. She knows something about the empty spaces in my life, the missing pieces that I can't quite name. Her cart always contains the same items: bread, milk, flowers, always white flowers. The mailbox key sticks now, requires more pressure than before, as if someone changed the lock, but that's impossible. I would have noticed. The bills arrive addressed to both of us, even now. The electric company hasn't caught up to the new reality. I've been driving past the cemetery lately, not visiting exactly, just observing. The groundskeeper waves from across the lawn, recognizing my car. Fresh flowers appear on certain graves with suspicious regularity. White roses mostly, sometimes lilies. The photograph that's missing from the hallway might have shown 2 figures, or 3. The outline on the wall suggests multiple shapes, overlapping shadows where bodies once stood together, but memory is unreliable, especially now. I found myself in the kitchen this morning holding a cup of coffee I don't remember making. The liquid was cold, skin formed across the surface. 2 spoons rested in the sink, though I always drink mine black, always have. The basement door stays locked now, not because I chose to lock it, but because the key disappeared, along with other small things that define the boundaries of normal life. A hairbrush, reading glasses, the blue sweater that smelled like vanilla and rain. The woman at the grocery store spoke to me today, asked about the garden, how the roses were growing. I don't have roses, never planted any. But I nodded anyway, felt the conversation flow around me like water around a stone. There are footprints in the dust beneath the bed, 2 sets, maybe 3, different sizes, different depths. The cleaning service stopped coming weeks ago, though I never canceled the arrangement. The house grows quieter without their Tuesday morning disruptions. I keep returning to that evening, the drawer standing open like a mouth, the metallic scent that mingles with lavender, the way shadows fell across the rug in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had arranged the blinds to create specific shapes. The key in my pocket grows heavier each day. I catch myself reaching for it during conversations, running my thumb across its worn edges. The brass has darkened where my fingers touch it most. Soon it will be black as the space inside that drawer. The phone rings less frequently now. When it does, the voice on the other end sounds increasingly distant. Familiar words spoken by unfamiliar throats. Questions about arrangements, about decisions that need making. I agree to everything without understanding what I'm accepting. Tonight I'll check the locks again, count my steps across the hardwood, listen for humming that never comes. The house will creak in new places, and I'll pretend not to notice. The drawer will remain closed, holding its darkness like a secret I'm not ready to hear. But the key burns against my palm, and somewhere in the distance, white flowers bloom in gardens I've never planted. Story 3. I had just silenced the chime of the grandfather clock. The usual tick was absent, leaving an unsettling void that gnawed at my senses. I traced the familiar grooves of the wooden mantelpiece, feeling the gentle thrum of the house settle around me. The faint aroma of burnt coffee lingered, curdling the morning air. My ears strained for the faint hum of life outside, but only the oppressive stillness answered. Then, as if the room inhaled sharply, the air shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but everything felt different, like a held breath waiting to exhale. I remember exactly why I stopped that clock. The chiming had become unbearable after what happened, each hourly announcement a reminder of time moving forward when everything should have stopped. My sister had been staying with me for 3 weeks, helping me sort through our mother's belongings after the funeral. She'd grown increasingly agitated by the sound, covering her ears each time it rang, muttering about how it made her feel trapped. That morning she'd finally snapped. I found her in the living room at dawn, standing on a chair trying to reach the clock's mechanism. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled with the pendulum case. I helped her down, made coffee, and we sat together in the kitchen while she explained how the chiming triggered something dark in her mind. She couldn't articulate what exactly, just that it felt wrong somehow. After breakfast, she announced she was leaving. Her decision seemed sudden, but I understood. Grief affects everyone differently. She packed quickly, efficiently, the way she'd always done everything. I drove her to the station, watched her board the afternoon train with a single suitcase and that worn leather purse she'd carried since college. She hugged me goodbye, promised to call when she reached her apartment. The train pulled away, and I returned home to silence the clock, honoring her request even in her absence. But something about that memory feels slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. The coffee cup on the kitchen counter was still warm when I returned from the station. 2 cups, actually. I'd forgotten about the second one until I walked in and saw it sitting there, lipstick stain on the rim in a shade my sister never wore. Too dark, too bold for her pale complexion. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to remember if she'd changed her makeup routine during her stay. Grief changes people in strange ways. I washed both cups, dried them, returned them to their proper places in the cabinet. The routine felt important, necessary, order after chaos, but my hands trembled slightly as I worked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was erasing something significant. The house felt different without her presence, larger somehow, yet more confining. I wandered through the rooms, straightening pillows she'd never sat on, adjusting curtains she'd never touched. In the guest bedroom where she'd slept, the bed was perfectly made, hospital corners crisp and tight, too perfect. My sister had always been messy, leaving rumpled sheets and scattered clothes in her wake. That's when I noticed the indent in the carpet beside the bed, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. The mark led from the bed to the window, ending at the sill where the paint was scratched. I knelt down, running my fingers along the groove in the carpet fibers. They were pressed down, flattened in a way that suggested weight, resistance, struggle. No, that's not right. I'm confusing details, mixing up timelines. She left voluntarily. I drove her to the station myself. Except I can't find my car keys. They should be on the hook by the front door where I always leave them. Instead, there's just the empty hook, brass worn smooth by years of use. I searched my pockets, the kitchen counter, the coffee table. Nothing. My wallet is in its usual place, along with my house keys, but the car keys have vanished. I tried to retrace my steps from the drive to the station. The route is burned into my memory from years of making the same trip. Down the hill, past the old cemetery, through the town center with its cluster of antique shops and that diner with the flickering neon sign. Left at the monument, then straight to the station parking lot. But when I close my eyes and try to visualize the journey, all I see is darkness. Not the comfortable darkness of forgetting, but something denser, more oppressive, like trying to peer through black water. My sister's phone goes straight to voicemail. The automated voice tells me the number is no longer in service, but I called her just last week to arrange her visit. The number was working then, her familiar voice answering on the third ring, tired but warm. I dial again, carefully checking each digit. Same result, disconnected. There's a business card in my wallet from the taxi company in town. I don't remember putting it there, but it's tucked behind my driver's license, edges soft with age. When I call, the dispatcher tells me they had no pickups from my address in the past month, no rides to the station, no record of any fare matching my sister's description. The train station is only 3 miles away. I could walk there, but my legs feel unsteady, unreliable. Instead, I sit in the living room and stare at the silent grandfather clock. Its face reflects the afternoon light streaming through the windows, creating patterns that shift and dance across the numbers. Something moves in my peripheral vision, a shadow passing by the window, too quick to identify but distinctly human in shape. I turn my head, but there's nothing there, just the empty yard and the neighbor's hedge that needs trimming. The shadow appears again, this time moving from right to left across the window frame. I stand up quickly, dizzy from the sudden movement, and press my face against the glass. The yard is empty. No footprints in the soft earth beneath the window, no disturbance in the fallen leaves. But I can smell something, faint but distinct. The perfume my sister wore, that light floral scent she'd used since high school. Its strongest near the window, as if she'd just walked past. I check the guest room again. The bed is still perfectly made, but now there's something else. A single hair on the pillow, dark brown like my sister's, but longer than she'd worn it in years. I pick it up, hold it to the light. It's real, substantial, not a trick of shadow or imagination. In the bathroom, her toothbrush is gone from the holder where it had sat for 3 weeks. The medicine cabinet is empty of her prescriptions, the anxiety medication and sleeping pills she'd needed since the divorce. But there's still a damp towel hanging on the rack, as if someone had showered recently. The logical explanation crumbles under the weight of these details. If she left voluntarily, took the train as I remember, why are there no records? Why can't I find my keys? Why does the house smell like her presence while simultaneously erasing every trace of her stay? I sit on the edge of the bathtub and try to reconstruct that final morning. She was agitated about the clock, yes, but there was something else, something I've been avoiding, an argument, raised voices, the sound of something breaking. The memory surfaces like a bubble rising through dark water. She wasn't just upset about the chiming. She was angry, furious, accusing me of something I couldn't understand. Her words came fast and sharp, cutting through the morning quiet like broken glass. She'd found something, a letter, maybe, or a photograph, something hidden in Mother's belongings that changed everything she thought she knew. She waved it at me, her face flushed with rage and betrayal. I tried to calm her, to explain, but she wouldn't listen. The details blur after that. Did she storm out? Did I drive her to the station? Or did something else happen, something my mind refuses to acknowledge? I return to the living room, to the silent grandfather clock. The The pendulum hangs motionless behind the glass like a held breath. When I open the case, I can see scratches on the brass mechanism, fresh gouges that weren't there before, as if someone had clawed at it desperately, trying to make it stop. There's something else inside the case, a piece of fabric caught on one of the gears. Dark blue cotton, the same color as the shirt my sister wore that last morning. I extract it carefully, noting how it's been torn, not cut, ripped away by force or struggle. The phone rings, startling me so badly that I drop the fabric. It rings 3 times before I can gather myself enough to answer. The voice on the other end is unfamiliar, official. They're asking about my sister, when I last saw her, whether she seemed distressed or mentioned plans to travel. The questions feel routine, practiced, like they've asked them many times before. I answer honestly, or as honestly as I can given my fractured memories. No, I haven't heard from her in several days. Yes, she seemed upset about our mother's death. No, she didn't mention any specific plans. The voice thanks me and hangs up, leaving me with more questions than answers. How did they know to call me? Who reported her missing? And why do I feel like I've just lied about something crucial? The afternoon light is fading, casting long shadows across the living room. The silent clock face reflects the dying sun, its hands frozen at 12:47. I don't remember what time I stopped the pendulum, but that moment feels significant somehow. 12:47, the exact time the afternoon train departs from the station. I close my eyes and try once more to remember driving her there. This time, instead of darkness, I see fragments, the back of her head in the passenger seat, her hands gripping her purse, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires as we pulled into the parking lot. But when we stop, she doesn't get out. She turns to face me, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She says something I can't quite hear, something about truth and consequences and how some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Then the memory fractures again, dissolving into sensation without meaning. The smell of car exhaust, the weight of something heavy, the taste of copper in my mouth. I open my eyes to find myself standing in the kitchen, though I don't remember walking there. My hands are wet, and there's a dish rag in my grip, wrung out and dripping. The sink is full of sudsy water, but I don't remember washing anything. The back door is ajar, letting in the evening air. Through the gap, I can see the garden where my mother grew her roses. The soil looks disturbed, freshly turned, as if someone had been digging recently. But it's too late in the season for planting and too early for spring preparation. I step outside, drawn by something I can't name. The evening air carries the scent of earth and decay, natural odors that seem somehow wrong in this context. My bare feet sink slightly into the soft ground as I approach the rose bed. There's definitely been digging here, a rectangular patch of soil, darker and looser than the surrounding earth, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide. The dimensions feel significant, purposeful, but I can't grasp why. A memory surfaces, sharp and clear. My sister kneeling in the same spot 3 days ago, crying as she planted a small memorial rose for our mother. Her tears mixed with the dirt on her hands as she patted the soil around the roots. Such a tender moment, full of grief and love. But that doesn't explain why the soil looks so recently disturbed, or why there's no sign of any plant. I kneel down and brush away the loose earth with my hands. A few inches down, my fingers encounter something that isn't soil. Fabric, the same dark blue cotton I found in the clock case. My hands shake as I clear away more dirt, revealing more fabric than something else. Metal, cold, and familiar. My missing car keys buried in the earth like some grotesque seed. The logical explanation I've been clinging to collapses entirely. She didn't take the train. She never left the house. And somewhere in the gaps of my memory, in the spaces between what I remember and what actually happened, lies a truth I'm not sure I'm strong enough to face. The evening shadows deepen around me as I kneel in the disturbed earth, holding my keys and trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The silent house looms behind me, keeping its secrets, while somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounds its lonely call. But I know now that my sister never heard it. Whatever happened that morning, whatever argument or revelation or moment of madness occurred, it ended here in this garden, under the roses our mother loved so much. The grandfather clock may be silent, but time continues its relentless march. And with each passing moment, the truth burrows deeper, like roots seeking dark soil, growing into something I may never have the courage to fully unearth. Story 4. The carpet felt wrong under my bare feet, its texture coarser and unfamiliar, like stepping onto a forgotten path. Each step released a subtle rustle, a sound that shouldn't have been here in this room, holding the weight of old whispers. I paused, the sensation clinging to me, urging me to remember. The eerie familiarity pressed against my senses, tugging at a memory clouded and vague. My eyes searched the dim corners, expecting to find nothing, hoping to see everything. I had felt this texture once before, in a place I couldn't quite place. It shouldn't have felt like an invitation, but it did. I know now that she moved it, the carpet. It wasn't always here, wasn't always this particular shade of burgundy with those thin gold threads woven through like veins. But when did I first notice? The mind plays tricks when you're living inside someone else's careful orchestration. You begin to doubt your own footsteps, your own memory of what belongs where. She had a way of rearranging things so subtly that you'd question whether they had ever been different at all. A photograph shifted 2 inches to the left. A book's spine turned inward so you couldn't read the title. The salt shaker moved from the left side of the stove to the right. Small things, meaningless things, or so I thought. The house breathed differently after she came to stay with us. I want to say it was the extra person, the additional weight on the floorboards, but that would be too simple, too rational. The truth lived somewhere in the spaces between what I observed and what I convinced myself I was imagining. She had this habit of humming while she cleaned, these low, tuneless sounds that seemed to seep into the walls. I'd catch myself listening for them even when she wasn't there. My spouse never seemed to notice, or perhaps they chose not to notice. There's a difference, though I'm not sure which possibility disturbs me more. They'd come home from work with that same tired smile, kiss my forehead in that same distracted way, and settle into their chair as if nothing in our carefully constructed world had shifted. But I felt it, in the way the light fell differently through the kitchen window, in how the refrigerator's hum seemed sharper, more insistent. She arrived on a Tuesday, I think, or maybe it was a Wednesday. The details blurred together now, like watercolors left in the rain. What I remember clearly is the single suitcase, brown leather with brass corners that had gone green with age. She set it down in the hallway with such deliberate care, as if she were marking territory, as if she were saying, "This is where I begin." The story she told us was simple enough. A temporary arrangement while she looked for her own place. Family helping family. My spouse's cousin, twice removed or once removed. The genealogy never quite clear in my mind. She had kind eyes and soft hands and a way of tilting her head when she listened that made you want to tell her things you hadn't planned to share. But kindness can be a performance, can't it? I learned that slowly. The way you learn to recognize the subtle shift in seasons. Not all at once, but in accumulated moments that add up to a truth you're not sure you want to acknowledge. The carpet appeared 3 weeks into her stay. I woke up one morning and there it was, spread across our bedroom floor like it had always belonged there. When I asked about it, she smiled that gentle smile and said she'd found it rolled up in the basement, thought it might brighten the room. My spouse nodded approvingly, mentioned how much cozier it made everything feel. I wanted to say that we'd never had a carpet there before, that I would have remembered, that I knew every inch of that room, every creak in the floorboards, every way the morning light painted patterns on the bare wood. But doubt is a poison that works slowly. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe my memory wasn't as reliable as I thought. Maybe the carpet had always been there and I'd simply never noticed. That's how it started, the questioning, the second guessing, the feeling that I was losing pieces of myself in small, imperceptible increments. She cooked dinner for us that night, a stew with vegetables I didn't recognize, seasoned with herbs that made the kitchen smell like somewhere else entirely. Somewhere foreign and ancient and not quite safe. My spouse praised the meal, asked for the recipe, suggested we should have her cook more often. I ate in silence, tasting something underneath the familiar flavors, something that reminded me of metal and earth and things better left buried. The photographs started changing next, not obviously, not in ways that would make you call the authorities or question someone's sanity, just subtle alterations. A family picture where my smile looked different, more strained. A vacation photo where the shadows fell in directions that didn't match my memory of that sunny afternoon. A wedding picture where my spouse's hand on my shoulder seemed to grip too tightly, fingers pressed into flesh like they were trying to hold something down. I mentioned it once, casually, over coffee while she sat at our kitchen table reading a book I'd never seen before, something with a dark cover and no visible title. She looked up with those kind eyes and asked what I meant. When I tried to explain, the words came out jumbled and paranoid. She nodded sympathetically, suggested that stress could play tricks on perception. Maybe I should consider talking to someone, professional help, nothing to be ashamed of. My spouse agreed. They'd been worried about me lately. I seemed distant, distracted, talking to myself, forgetting conversations we'd had just the day before. Maybe some counseling would help, maybe some medication, nothing serious, just something to take the edge off. But I wasn't forgetting, I was remembering things that didn't fit the narrative being constructed around me, like how our house key had been copied, though no one could explain when or why. Like how the neighbor's dog had stopped barking when she walked by, not out of friendliness, but out of something that looked more like fear. Like how certain rooms felt colder when she'd been in them, as if something vital had been drawn out of the air. The dreams started around the same time, not nightmares exactly, but something more subtle and more disturbing. Dreams where I was walking through my own house, but the rooms were arranged differently, where familiar objects cast unfamiliar shadows, where voices spoke in languages I almost understood but not quite. I'd wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth and the feeling that someone had been watching me sleep. She was always so helpful about the dreams, so concerned. She'd make me chamomile tea and sit with me at the kitchen table while I tried to explain what I'd seen. She'd nod and make soft, sympathetic sounds and suggest that maybe I was working through some deep-seated anxieties. Maybe the stress of having a house guest was more difficult than I wanted to admit. Maybe I should consider taking some time off work, some time to rest and recover and find my center again. The suggestions always seemed so reasonable, so caring, so perfectly designed to isolate me further from any sense of reliable reality. I began keeping a journal, not on paper because paper could be found and read and judged, but mental notes, careful observations, the way she moved through our house like she was following a map only she could see, the way she touched certain objects with a familiarity that suggested prior knowledge, the way she watched my spouse when they thought no one was looking, with an expression that was neither familial nor innocent. The journal entries multiplied in my mind, cross-referenced and categorized and analyzed until I had built an elaborate structure of suspicion. But suspicion of what exactly? What crime was being committed? What evidence could I point to that wouldn't sound like the ravings of someone losing their grip on sanity? She was unfailingly polite, helpful around the house, grateful for our hospitality. She paid for groceries without being asked, cleaned bathrooms without being prompted, and remembered details about our lives with the kind of attention that felt like genuine care. If I tried to explain my concerns to anyone outside our household, I would sound petty at best, delusional at worst. But the carpet kept rustling under my feet, that coarse, unfamiliar texture that spoke of somewhere else, somewhere I had been but couldn't quite remember. The sound it made was like whispers in a language I used to know, like secrets being shared between the threads and the floorboards and the walls that had learned to keep too many confidences. I started researching her story, quietly, carefully, using the computer at the library so there would be no digital trail leading back to our house. The details she'd given us about her life were sparse but consistent. A job that had ended unexpectedly, a lease that couldn't be renewed, family connections that were distant but real enough to justify temporary assistance. Everything checked out, everything made sense, everything fit together so perfectly that it began to feel rehearsed, like a story that had been polished through multiple tellings until all the rough edges had been worn smooth, like a performance that had been perfected through repetition. The more I investigated, the more I realized how little I actually knew about my spouse's family. We'd been together for years, but the subject of extended relatives rarely came up. There were no holiday gatherings, no birthday cards from distant cousins, no family reunions or genealogy discussions. Our life together existed in a kind of vacuum, insulated from the complications of broader family connections, which made her arrival feel less like coincidence and more like careful planning. But planning for what? What did she want from us? What was she hoping to accomplish with her subtle rearrangements and gentle manipulations? The answer, when it finally came to me, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet recognition, like remembering the name of a song that had been playing in the background of your thoughts for weeks. She wasn't trying to take anything from us. She was trying to replace something, to substitute one reality for another so gradually that we wouldn't notice the transition until it was already complete. The carpet was just the beginning, a test to see how much I would accept without question, how far my sense of reality could be bent before it snapped entirely. Each small change was designed to erode my confidence in my own perceptions, to make me doubt not just what I was seeing, but my right to trust what I was seeing. And it was working. I found myself questioning memories that had once felt solid and reliable, wondering if conversations I remembered had actually taken place, or if they were constructions of an increasingly unstable mind. Looking in mirrors and seeing a face that seemed somehow different from the one I expected to find there. My spouse began to feel like a stranger, not because they had changed, but because I was starting to see them through her eyes instead of my own. They became someone to be managed rather than loved, someone whose responses could be predicted and manipulated through the careful application of suggestion and circumstance. I tried to fight back, to reclaim some sense of agency in my own life. I rearranged furniture when she wasn't looking, moved photographs back to their original positions, threw away foods that tasted like metal and earth and buried secrets. But my efforts felt futile and increasingly desperate, like trying to hold back a tide with bare hands. The dreams intensified. Now I was walking through houses that looked like ours but weren't quite right, rooms that extended in directions that defied physics. hallways that led back to themselves in impossible loops, and always, somewhere in the background, that rustling sound, like footsteps on a carpet that didn't belong where it had been placed. I began to suspect that the dreams weren't dreams at all, that I was walking through our house while I slept, guided by impulses I didn't understand toward discoveries I wasn't ready to make. I'd wake up with dirt under my fingernails, though I couldn't remember gardening, with the taste of basement air in my lungs, though I hadn't been downstairs in weeks, with knowledge of hiding places in our own home that I'd never known existed. The basement became a source of particular fascination and dread. She'd found the carpet there, rolled up and waiting. What else might be hidden in that space beneath our daily lives? What other artifacts of previous occupants or previous versions of ourselves might be tucked away in corners we'd never thought to explore? I started making excuses to go downstairs, checking the water heater, organizing storage boxes, looking for seasonal decorations that we'd never actually owned. The basement felt different from the rest of the house, older, more honest, like it had been there long before our walls were built around it and would remain long after our walls had crumbled away. In the far corner, behind a shelf of paint cans and forgotten Christmas ornaments, I found a door I'd never noticed before. Not a hidden door exactly, just one that had been so thoroughly ignored that it might as well have been invisible. The kind of door that your eyes slide past without registering, that your mind categorizes as unimportant and files away under things not worth remembering. The door was locked, but the key was hanging on a nail just to the right of the frame, as if someone wanted it to be found, but only by someone who was looking carefully enough, someone who had moved beyond casual observation into the realm of active investigation. Behind the door was another room, smaller than the main basement, with walls of older brick and a floor of packed earth. The air smelled like the herbs she used in her cooking, like metal and earth and things better left buried. And there, spread across the earthen floor like a mirror of the one in our bedroom, was another carpet. The same burgundy color, the same thin gold threads, the same coarse texture that rustled with secrets. But this carpet was older, stained in places with substances I didn't want to identify, worn thin in patterns that suggested frequent use by someone who walked the same paths over and over, following routes that had been established through repetition rather than logic. I understood then that I had found the original. The carpet in our bedroom was a copy, a reproduction designed to prepare me for this moment, to make the discovery feel like recognition rather than revelation, to ensure that when I finally found this hidden room, it would feel like coming home rather than stumbling into someone else's secret. The walls of the room were covered with photographs, not family pictures or vacation snapshots, but surveillance images. Pictures of our house taken from different angles and at different times. Pictures of my spouse leaving for work, coming home from work, checking the mail, mowing the lawn. Pictures of me in the kitchen, in the garden, sleeping in our bed before the carpet had been placed there. And pictures of her, but not recent pictures. These were older, showing her in other houses with other families, always the same role. Always the helpful relative, the temporary house guest, the kind stranger who arrived with a single suitcase and a plausible story. But the faces around her changed, the settings changed, the families changed. I realized I was looking at a career, a profession, a systematic approach to something I still couldn't quite name, but was beginning to understand in the way you understand hunger or thirst or fear. Not through explanation, but through direct experience. The photographs told a story of careful patience, of months spent studying targets, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, of preparations that went far beyond simple observation. of a process that had been refined through repetition until it had achieved a kind of terrible efficiency. I backed out of the room slowly, carefully replacing the key on its nail, making sure the door was locked exactly as I had found it. But I carried the knowledge with me like a weight in my chest. The understanding that our house had been mapped and measured and claimed long before she had arrived with her single suitcase and her gentle smile. The carpet in our bedroom felt different after that, not just wrong but actively malevolent, like it was listening to our conversations, recording our movements, reporting back to someone who was building a detailed inventory of our lives. I found myself avoiding it when possible, walking around its edges, stepping carefully on the exposed floorboards that still felt like they belonged to us. But avoidance was becoming increasingly difficult. The carpet seemed to expand each day, covering more of the floor, claiming more territory. Soon it would be impossible to move through the room without stepping on it, without participating in whatever ritual or process it represented. I tried to tell my spouse about the basement room, about the photographs and the evidence of systematic surveillance, but the words came out wrong, jumbled and paranoid and easily dismissed. They looked at me with concern and suggested that maybe the stress was getting to be too much. Maybe I should talk to someone. Maybe I should consider taking that medication we discussed. She nodded sympathetically from her place at the kitchen table, her book closed now, her attention focused entirely on our conversation. She agreed that I seemed to be struggling with something, that the transition to having a house guest was clearly more difficult than any of us had anticipated. Maybe it would be better if she found somewhere else to stay. She didn't want to be the cause of any family tension. But even as she spoke the words, I could see that she had no intention of leaving, that this expression of concern was just another manipulation, another way of making me appear unreasonable and demanding. If I agreed that she should go, I would seem ungrateful and inhospitable. If I insisted that she stay, I would be contradicting my own complaints about her presence. The trap was perfect in its simplicity. No matter what I chose, I would be wrong. No matter how I responded, I would appear unstable and unreliable. She had created a situation where my only options were different varieties of defeat. That night I lay awake listening to the sounds of the house. The familiar creaks and settles that had once felt comforting now seemed ominous, like the building itself was shifting to accommodate new purposes, new inhabitants, new definitions of what constituted home and safety and belonging. I could hear her moving around downstairs, not obviously, not in ways that would wake a normal sleeper. But I had moved beyond normal sleep into a state of hyper-vigilant awareness where every sound carried meaning and every silence suggested hidden activity. She was rearranging things again. I could tell from the subtle changes in the house's acoustic signature, the way sounds bounced differently off walls when furniture had been moved, the way floorboards responded to weight distributed in unfamiliar patterns. She was preparing for something, making final adjustments to a plan that had been months in the making. I wanted to get up to confront her, to demand explanations for the basement room and the photographs and the systematic documentation of our lives. But I found myself paralyzed by the certainty that any action I took would only accelerate whatever process was already underway. That confrontation would trigger responses I wasn't prepared to handle. So I lay there in the darkness, feeling the coarse texture of the carpet against my bare feet where they hung over the edge of the bed, listening to the rustling sounds it made with each small movement, remembering that first moment of recognition, that sense of having felt this texture before in a place I couldn't quite identify. Now I knew where I had felt it, in dreams that weren't quite dreams, in midnight wanderings through rooms that existed beneath the rooms we lived in during daylight hours, in spaces that had been prepared for me long before I knew they existed. The carpet had been calling to me, drawing me toward discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about safety and home and the reliability of my own perceptions. The morning brought no relief. If anything, the daylight made everything worse by revealing how normal everything appeared, how easily the night's revelations could be dismissed as products of an overactive imagination and insufficient sleep. How reasonable it would sound if someone suggested that I was having some kind of breakdown, seeing threats where none existed, constructing elaborate conspiracies out of ordinary coincidences. She made breakfast for us, eggs and toast and coffee that tasted exactly like it always had. She hummed while she cooked, those same tuneless sounds that seemed to seep into the walls. My spouse thanked her, complimented the meal, suggested that we were lucky to have such a helpful house guest. I ate in silence, tasting metal and earth underneath the familiar flavors, feeling the weight of knowledge I couldn't share without sounding delusional, understanding that I had been isolated not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the simple expedient of making truth sound like madness. The carpet felt wrong under my bare feet, its texture coarser and unfamiliar, like stepping onto a forgotten path. Each step released a subtle rustle, a sound that shouldn't have been here in this room, holding the weight of old whispers. I paused, the sensation clinging to me, urging me to remember. But now I understood what I was remembering, not just where I had felt this texture before, but what it meant, what it represented, what it was preparing me for. The eerie familiarity no longer pressed against my senses like a question. It wrapped around them like an answer I wasn't sure I wanted to accept. But acceptance, I was learning, was rarely a choice. Sometimes it was simply the last option remaining when all the others had been carefully, systematically eliminated. Story 5. The weight of silence. It wasn't the first time the clock chimed twice. The sound echoed softly down the hallway, bouncing off closed doors and empty rooms. I noticed how the air felt different, a little thicker, but didn't think much of it. The mail was a day late, scattered on the front porch as though dropped in haste. Inside, the shoes were neatly aligned, though one pair was missing its laces. I didn't ask questions. Instead, I picked up the fallen newspaper, smoothing out its creases. I glanced once at the attic door before heading to my room. I turned off the fan, though it was still warm. The house had always been quiet, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, made you aware of your own breathing. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it, as if making any sound might disturb something better left undisturbed. My neighbor had been gone for 3 days, not unusual really. She traveled often for work, left her car parked in the same spot, keys hidden under the ceramic frog by her front steps. Everyone on the street knew about the frog. It was one of those neighborhood secrets that wasn't really a secret at all. But her mail was piling up. The newspaper lay yellowing on her walkway. And yesterday, I could have sworn I heard her television playing late into the evening, that familiar blue glow flickering behind her living room curtains. I decided to check on her. The ceramic frog felt cold under my fingers, colder than it should have been for such a warm afternoon. The key was there just as always, but it took longer than usual to turn in the lock. The door opened with a soft creak, and immediately I was hit with a smell I couldn't quite place. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong somehow, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Her living room looked normal. The television was off now, the screen reflecting my own uncertain face back at me. Her coffee mug sat on the side table, a ring of dried liquid at the bottom. The newspaper from several days ago lay folded on her lap as if she had just set it down to answer the phone. Except she wasn't there. I called her name softly, then louder. No response. The house seemed to absorb my voice, swallowing it whole. I moved through the rooms methodically, checking each one. Kitchen, clean dishes in the drying rack, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic on the counter. Bedroom, bed made with military precision, clothes laid out for the next day. Bathroom, toothbrush still damp, though that could mean anything. It was in the basement that I found the first real clue something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, unusual for someone as meticulous as my neighbor. She kept everything in its place, every door closed, every surface clean. I pushed it open and descended the wooden steps, each one groaning under my weight. The basement smelled different from the rest of the house, earthier, more metallic. At the bottom of the stairs, I fumbled for the light switch and found it after several seconds of blind searching. The fluorescent bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor. Most of the basement looked exactly as I expected. Storage boxes neatly labeled, holiday decorations organized by season, tools hanging in perfect rows on a pegboard. But in the far corner, something was different. The concrete floor showed signs of recent disturbance, not obvious but noticeable if you were looking. A patch roughly the size of a person where the dust patterns didn't quite match the rest of the floor, and beside it, a small dark stain that could have been oil or paint or something else entirely. I knelt down and touched the stain with my fingertip. It was dry but not old, recent enough to still feel slightly tacky. When I brought my finger close to my nose, the metallic smell grew stronger. That's when I heard the footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the kitchen floor. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The steps paused directly above me, and I could hear the soft creak of floorboards settling under someone's weight. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the front of the house. I heard the soft click of the front door opening, then closing. I waited several more heartbeats before moving, then crept up the basement stairs as quietly as I could manage. The kitchen was empty, but the smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. My neighbor didn't smoke, had never smoked as far as I knew. I looked out the front window and saw a figure walking away down the street. Average height, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. They moved with purpose, but without hurry, hands shoved deep in their pockets. I couldn't make out their face, but something about their posture seemed familiar. After they disappeared around the corner, I returned to the basement. The stain seemed darker now, more pronounced in the harsh fluorescent light. I took photos with my phone, though I wasn't sure why. Some instinct told me I might need evidence later. I searched the rest of the basement more thoroughly. Behind a stack of storage boxes, I found something that made my stomach clench. A piece of fabric, torn and stained with the same dark substance I'd found on the floor. The fabric was from a blouse, pale blue with small white buttons. I recognized it because I'd complimented my neighbor on it just last week when we chatted over the fence about her garden. I called the police from my own house, speaking to a dispatcher who sounded bored and overworked. Missing person reports required waiting periods, she explained. Adults had the right to disappear if they wanted to. Unless there were signs of foul play, there wasn't much they could do. I mentioned the basement, the stain, the fabric. The dispatcher's tone shifted slightly, became more attentive. She said someone would come by to take a look. The officer who arrived was younger than I expected, with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform. He listened to my story with professional patience, taking notes in a small spiral notebook. When I showed him the basement, he examined the stain and the fabric with a small flashlight, though the overhead light was perfectly adequate. He asked questions about my neighbor. How well did I know her? Did she have family nearby? A boyfriend? Any enemies or recent problems? I realized how little I actually knew about her life beyond our brief conversations over the garden fence. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, worked in some kind of office job that required occasional travel. Never had many visitors, though I'd seen the same car parked in her driveway several times over the past few months, a dark sedan with tinted windows. The officer made more notes. He said they'd file a report and keep an eye out for her. The basement evidence would be processed, though he cautioned that it might take time to get results. These things usually had simple explanations, he said. People left town unexpectedly all the time. But as he was leaving, he turned back to me with a strange expression. You said you heard someone upstairs while you were in the basement. I nodded. And you saw them leave. Yes, someone in a dark jacket. He wrote something else in his notebook, then looked at me more carefully. You have a key to her house. She keeps one hidden for emergencies. Right, he closed the notebook. Maybe don't go back over there until we figure out what's going on. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the person I'd seen walking away from the house. The more I replayed the memory, the more certain I became that I'd seen that walk before. The slight hunch to the shoulders, the way they favored their left leg just barely. I started paying closer attention to my neighbors, watching from my window as people came and went. The man from the corner house walked his dog at the same times each day, but his gait was completely different. The woman across the street moved with quick, nervous energy. The elderly couple next door barely walked at all anymore. It was the mailman who finally triggered the recognition. I was watching from my kitchen window when he approached my neighbor's house. He moved with that same deliberate pace, that same slight favor of the left leg. When he reached her front door, he didn't just drop the mail and leave. He stood there for several long moments, looking at the accumulating newspapers, the unopened mail slot. Then he walked around to the side of the house, out of my direct view. I moved to the side window and watched him examine the basement window wells, peering down into them as if looking for something specific. He spent several minutes at each window before returning to the front of the house. But instead of continuing his route, he sat down on her front steps and pulled out a cigarette. I remembered the smell of smoke in her kitchen. My hands were shaking as I called the police station. The same dispatcher answered, and I asked to speak with the officer who had taken my report. He wasn't available, she said, but she could take a message. I tried to explain about the mailman, about the cigarette smoke, about the way he'd been examining her basement windows. It sounded paranoid even to me. Mailmen were supposed to notice when mail piled up, weren't they? Maybe he was just being conscientious. The dispatcher said she'd pass along the message. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the fabric I'd found, about the stain on the concrete floor, about my neighbor's coffee mug sitting on her side table as if she just stepped away for a moment. I found myself at my bedroom window, looking out at her dark house. The streetlight cast long shadows across her yard, and every shifting branch looked like a person moving in the darkness. Around what must have been the middle of the night, I saw a light in her basement window. Just a brief flicker, as if someone had turned on a flashlight for a few seconds before switching it off again. I stared at the window until my eyes watered, but the light didn't return. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but when the dispatcher asked what my emergency was, I found myself struggling to explain. A light in a basement wasn't exactly a crime. For all I knew, the police had left something on during their investigation. But they hadn't been back to investigate. The officer had taken my report and left, and I hadn't heard anything since. I decided to go look for myself. The ceramic frog was gone. I searched the area around her front steps carefully, thinking it might have been moved or knocked over, but it was nowhere to be found. The spare key was gone with it. I walked around the house, checking windows and doors. Everything was locked tight. But when I reached the basement window where I'd seen the light, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The window was open, just a crack, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And the screen had been cut, a neat slice just large enough for someone to reach through and manipulate the window latch. I called the police again, and this time they took me seriously. 2 officers arrived within minutes, their patrol cars' red and blue lights painting the quiet street in alternating colors. Neighbors began appearing at their windows and front doors, drawn by the unusual activity. The officers entered through the basement window, and I waited on the sidewalk with growing anxiety. They were inside for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When they emerged, their expressions were grim. They called for backup. More cars arrived, then an ambulance, then people in plain clothes carrying cameras and equipment. The street filled with official vehicles, their radios crackling with coded communications I couldn't understand. One of the detectives, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, came over to speak with me. She introduced herself, but I immediately forgot her name, too focused on trying to read her expression. "We found something," she said simply. "We're going to need to ask you some more detailed questions." The questions came in waves over the following days. Different officers, different rooms at the police station, but the same basic inquiries repeated endlessly. How well did I know my neighbor? When had I last seen her? Why had I gone into her house in the first place? Had I touched anything, moved anything? Was I certain about the timeline? They asked about the mailman. When had I first noticed him acting strangely? Had I ever seen him interact with my neighbor? Did I know his name, his route, how long he'd worked in the neighborhood? I answered as best I could, but I realized how little I actually knew about anything. My neighbor remained a mystery despite our years of casual conversation. I didn't know her last name, her age, where she worked, or whether she had family. The mailman was just a uniform and a routine, someone I'd seen hundreds of times without really seeing at all. The detective with the graying hair told me they'd found remains in the basement. Not recent, she said, probably buried there for months. The investigation would take time, but they had reason to believe my neighbor had discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. They arrested the mailman 3 days later. The local news covered the story extensively, though they kept most of the details vague. A postal worker suspected of murder, a missing woman, a neighbor who'd become suspicious when mail started piling up. They didn't mention that the mailman had been using his route to case houses for break-ins, or that he'd been hiding stolen goods in basements throughout the neighborhood for years, or that my neighbor had apparently come home early from a business trip and found him in her basement, standing over a hole in the concrete floor. They didn't mention that there were other remains, older ones dating back years. The mailman's lawyer claimed his client was innocent, that the evidence was circumstantial. The trial was scheduled for the following year, assuming they could build a strong enough case. These things took time, the detective explained. Justice was a slow process. But I couldn't stop thinking about the person I'd seen walking away from my neighbor's house that first day. The deliberate pace, the slight limp, the dark jacket. The mailman walked differently when he wasn't working, apparently. More relaxed, less careful about hiding the injury to his left leg. He'd been watching me watch him, I realized, probably for days before I'd finally recognized him. He'd known I was getting close to figuring it out. The ceramic frog turned up in a storm drain 6 blocks away. The spare key was never found. I moved out of the neighborhood before the trial began. I told myself it was because of the memories, the way every quiet evening reminded me of that first strange silence. But really, it was because of the questions that wouldn't leave me alone. How many times had the mailman been in my neighbor's house before that final day? How long had he been using neighborhood basements as hiding places? And why had I been so quick to trust that the person I'd seen walking away was definitely the same person who'd been inside? The security footage from a business 3 blocks away showed someone matching the mailman's description in the area that day. But the image was grainy, the timestamp unclear. His lawyer argued it proved nothing. I never testified at the trial. The prosecutor said my testimony wasn't necessary, that they had enough physical evidence to secure a conviction. But I knew the real reason. My story had too many holes, too many assumptions, too many moments where I'd filled in details my memory couldn't quite support. The mailman was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years. The judge called it a crime of opportunity that had escalated beyond the defendant's control. The victim had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But late at night, in my new house in my new neighborhood, I still find myself wondering about the details that never quite fit. The coffee mug on the side table, still warm when I'd found it. The television that had been playing the night before, though my neighbor had supposedly been missing for days. The way the basement light had flickered on and off that final night, as if someone was down there looking for something they'd left behind. I have a new mailman now. He's younger, friendlier, always ready with a wave and a comment about the weather. His uniform is always clean, his route efficient and predictable. But sometimes I catch myself watching him from my window, noting the way he walks, the way he pauses at certain houses, wondering what he sees when he looks at all those front doors, all those basement windows, all those ceramic frogs hiding spare keys. The truth is, we never really know our neighbors. We never really know anyone. We see what they want us to see, believe what they want us to believe. And sometimes, when the silence gets too thick and the air feels too heavy, we discover that the person we trusted most was the one we should have feared all along. The clock in my new house chimes only once each hour, but sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I could swear I hear that double chime echoing down the hallway, a sound that shouldn't exist in a place where it never belonged. I don't investigate strange sounds anymore. I've learned that some silences are better left undisturbed. Story 6. The light switch made no click. My fingers danced over it again, seeking the familiar push, but it remained a silent witness. Walking through the hallway, the air should have carried the echoes of footsteps, a reassurance of presence, yet the sound dissolved into nothingness. The carpet fibers whispered against my feet, pretending to offer comfort, yet felt oddly distant. I paused at the window, expecting the usual play of shadows, only to find the glass staring back with a vacant stillness. Something was missing, or perhaps more accurately, something was there waiting. The house had been silent for weeks now, though I couldn't pinpoint when the silence began. Perhaps it started with the photograph I found tucked behind the medicine cabinet, a picture I didn't remember taking. Two figures stood on what looked like a pier, their faces turned away from the camera, toward water that stretched beyond the frame's edge. One figure wore a jacket I recognized, the navy windbreaker with the torn pocket, the one that used to hang by the back door. I remember staring at that photograph for what felt like hours, turning it over in my hands, searching for some indication of when it was taken, where, why. The paper felt new, the colors too vivid for something forgot. Yet I had no memory of standing on that pier, no recollection of the person beside me in the frame. The water in the background appeared calm, almost glass-like, reflecting nothing. The jacket disappeared shortly after I found the photograph. I searched through closets, checked the laundry room, even looked in places where it couldn't possibly be inside kitchen cabinets, under bathroom sinks. The absence felt deliberate, calculated. Objects don't simply vanish without reason, yet reason seemed to have abandoned this house along with the familiar sounds. When I think back to the beginning, though I'm no longer certain where the beginning actually lies, I recall the sensation of being watched. Not by eyes exactly, but by the house itself, as if the walls had developed a consciousness, a quiet awareness that followed my movements from room to room. The feeling was strongest near the windows, particularly the one facing the street, where I often stood in the mornings, coffee cup in hand, observing the neighborhood's slow awakening. But the mornings changed. The coffee began tasting different, though I used the same beans, the same routine. The newspaper arrived folded differently, sections rearranged in ways that made no sense. Small changes, insignificant to anyone else, yet they accumulated like sediment, building layers of unease that I couldn't shake. I started keeping a journal documenting these minor disturbances, convinced that patterns would emerge if I recorded them carefully enough. The pen felt strange in my hand, as if I'd forgotten how to write, and my handwriting appeared unfamiliar on the page, more angular, less fluid than I remembered. Reading back through the entries, I found gaps in my memory, descriptions of events I couldn't recall experiencing. One entry mentioned a phone call about a boat rental, a conversation I supposedly had regarding weekend plans. I don't remember making such a call, don't remember having weekend plans that involved boats or water. Yet the entry was detailed, specific, written in my own hand. The caller had mentioned a pier, described the way morning light reflected off the water, suggested meeting near the marina before sunrise. The marina, the word triggered something, a half-formed memory of standing on wooden planks, feeling them shift beneath my feet with the gentle motion of the tide. Salt air mixing with the smell of creosote and rope, the sound of water lapping against hulls, a rhythmic whisper that seemed to carry messages I couldn't quite understand. But when I tried to focus on the memory, it slipped away like water through cupped hands. I began driving to places without destinations, following roads that felt familiar yet strange, as if I were retracing steps I'd never consciously taken. The car seemed to know the way, guiding itself through turns and intersections while my mind drifted. I found myself parking near bodies of water, lakes, rivers, anywhere the land met liquid. Each location felt significant, though I couldn't explain why. At one such place, a small lake surrounded by pine trees, I discovered tire tracks in the soft earth near the water's edge. The pattern matched my car's treads, yet I had no memory of driving so close to the water, no recollection of parking in such a precarious position. The tracks led right to the lake's margin, stopping just short of where the ground became too soft to support a vehicle's weight. Standing there, studying those tracks, I felt a presence behind me, not threatening exactly, but watchful. I turned slowly, expecting to find another person, but saw only trees and shadow. The feeling persisted, that sense of being observed, evaluated. The wind picked up, rustling leaves in a pattern that almost sounded like whispered conversation, words just beyond the edge of comprehension. The photograph remained on my kitchen table, a constant reminder of something I couldn't quite grasp. I studied it obsessively, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail. The pier in the background showed signs of weathering, paint peeling from the railings, gaps between the planks. Water stains on the wooden posts suggested regular flooding, the kind that comes with storm surges or unusually high tides. But it was the second figure that haunted me most, slightly shorter than the person in the navy jacket, wearing what appeared to be a light-colored shirt or sweater. The posture suggested familiarity, comfort with the person taking the photograph. Their hand rested on the pier's railing, fingers relaxed, wedding ring visible even in the photograph's soft focus. I don't wear a wedding ring, never have. Yet looking at my own hand, I noticed a pale band of skin on my ring finger, as if something had been worn there regularly, recently removed. The skin was softer in that spot, protected from sun and wear. When I pressed against it, the sensation felt oddly familiar, like touching a scar from an injury I couldn't remember sustaining. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed, listening to the house settle around me, but the sound seemed wrong. Footsteps in rooms where no one walked, the soft closing of doors I knew I'd left open, water running through pipes when no faucets were turned on. Each sound had a logical explanation. Old houses make noise, plumbing systems have their own rhythms, yet logic felt insufficient to explain the growing sense that I was not alone. The dreams, when they came, were filled with water. Sometimes I was standing on a dock, watching boats disappear into fog. Other times I was in a boat myself, rowing toward a shore that never seemed to get closer. The water was always calm, mirror-like, reflecting clouds that moved too slowly across the sky. In these dreams, I was searching for something, though I never knew what. Waking from these dreams left me disoriented, uncertain which reality was true. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur, memories mixing with dream images until I couldn't distinguish between them. I would find myself standing in the kitchen, holding the photograph, with no memory of getting out of bed, no sense of how much time had passed. The journal entries became more erratic, my handwriting changing from day to day, sometimes within the same entry. I wrote about conversations I might have imagined, about seeing the navy jacket hanging in closets where I knew it couldn't be. I described the taste of salt air, the feeling of wooden planks beneath my feet, the sound of water against a boat's hull. Yet I couldn't recall experiencing any of these sensations outside of dreams. One entry, written in handwriting I barely recognized as my own, described a morning spent at the marina. The words were vivid, detailed, describing the way fog clung to the water's surface, how seagulls wheeled overhead calling to each other in voices that sounded almost human. The entry mentioned waiting for someone, checking the time repeatedly, growing concerned as minutes stretched into hours. But I don't remember writing those words, don't remember visiting any marina. The entry felt like fiction, yet the details were too specific, too sensory to be entirely imagined. The description of salt-crusted rope, the particular shade of green paint on a nearby boat's hull, the way morning light filtered through fog, these weren't details I could have conjured from nothing. I began to suspect that someone else was writing in my journal, adding entries while I slept or during the growing periods of lost time that seemed to punctuate my days. Yet the handwriting, however changed, was recognizably mine. The pen I used was always exactly where I'd left it, the journal closed and placed precisely on the nightstand. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of another person's presence. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were gradually moving inward, reducing the space I inhabited. Rooms I rarely entered seemed to shrink when I wasn't looking, doorways narrowing, ceilings lowering. The hallway where I'd first noticed the silent light switch appeared longer some days, shorter others, as if distance itself had become unreliable. Photographs throughout the house began changing, or perhaps I began noticing changes that had always been there. In pictures of family gatherings, faces looked different, expressions altered. A smile that had seemed genuine now appeared forced. Eyes that had looked directly at the camera now seemed to be gazing at something just beyond the frame. The changes were subtle, the kind that might be explained by failing memory or shifting perspective, yet they felt deliberate. The photograph from behind the medicine cabinet multiplied. I found copies tucked into books, slipped between pages of magazines, folded inside jacket pockets. Each copy was identical to the original, yet somehow different. The shadows fell at slightly different angles. The water in the background showed different patterns of light. It was as if multiple photographs had been taken of the same scene, each capturing a slightly different moment. I tried to destroy one of the copies, tearing it into small pieces and throwing them away. The next morning, the photograph was back, whole and unmarked, lying on the kitchen table beside the original. The torn pieces had vanished from the trash, leaving no evidence of my attempt at destruction. The photograph seemed to exist independently of my actions, resistant to change or elimination. The sensation of being watched intensified. I installed new locks, checked windows repeatedly, even set up a camera system to monitor the house while I slept. The recording showed nothing unusual, just me, moving through rooms in the middle of the night, sometimes carrying the photograph, sometimes standing motionless by windows, staring out at darkness. In the recordings, my movements appeared purposeful, as if I knew exactly what I was doing, yet I had no memory of these nocturnal wanderings. Water began appearing in unexpected places, puddles on bathroom floors where no pipes leaked, damp spots on walls that showed no signs of structural damage, the smell of salt air in rooms far from any ocean. I called repair services, had the house inspected from foundation to roof, but no one could find sources for the water or explanations for the persistent maritime smells. The taste of salt became constant, coating my tongue even after brushing my teeth, rinsing with mouthwash, drinking fresh water. Food began tasting different, as if seasoned with brine. Coffee carried hints of seaweed. Even tap water seemed tinged with ocean minerals. My body was adapting to an environment that didn't exist, preparing for conditions I couldn't identify. I started avoiding mirrors, disturbed by the person who looked back. My reflection appeared tired, older, marked by experiences I couldn't remember having. There were lines around my eyes that seemed too deep, too numerous for my age. My skin had a weathered quality, as if I'd spent years exposed to sun and salt air. Most unsettling were my eyes. They held a knowledge I didn't possess, a sadness I couldn't explain. The journal entries began addressing someone directly, written in the second person as if I were having a conversation. "You said you'd meet me at the pier," one entry read. "You promised the boat would be ready before dawn." These entries described elaborate plans, detailed arrangements for trips I didn't remember planning. They mentioned specific locations, particular boats, weather conditions that needed to be considered. Reading these entries felt like eavesdropping on someone else's life, yet the handwriting was undeniably mine, the pen strokes familiar despite their strangeness. I began to wonder if I was losing time more extensively than I'd realized, living entire experiences that my conscious mind couldn't access. Perhaps I had another life, parallel to the one I remembered, filled with boats and piers and salt water. The navy jacket reappeared as suddenly as it had vanished, hanging exactly where it had always hung. the torn pocket still torn, the fabric still carrying the faint smell of ocean air. I examined it carefully, searching for clues about where it had been, but found nothing unusual. It was simply back, as if it had never been gone, as if my memory of its absence was the aberration. Inside the pocket, I found a marina receipt, though the ink was too faded to read clearly. The paper felt old, worn soft by handling, yet I had no memory of visiting any marina, no recollection of whatever transaction had generated the receipt. The date was illegible, the amount unclear, but the header suggested a boat rental, perhaps equipment of some kind. I began to accept that my memory was unreliable, that significant portions of my life were occurring outside my conscious awareness. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating. If I couldn't trust my own recollections, then perhaps the growing strangeness of my situation was simply the result of incomplete information, gaps in perception rather than changes in reality. Yet the photograph remained, solid and undeniable, proof that something had happened, even if I couldn't remember what. The two figures on the pier became my anchors, the only concrete evidence of experiences that felt increasingly dreamlike. I studied their postures, their positioning relative to each other, searching for clues about their relationship, their purpose for being there. The person in the navy jacket stood slightly behind the other figure, one hand resting on their shoulder in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. The touch appeared natural, comfortable, suggesting familiarity built over time. These weren't strangers who had just met, but people who knew each other well, who had stood together in similar ways before. But if I was one of these figures, who was the other, and who had taken the photograph? The questions multiplied without answers, creating a web of uncertainty that grew more complex with each examination. Every detail I noticed spawned new mysteries, new possibilities that I couldn't verify or dismiss. The house continued its subtle transformations, walls shifting when I wasn't looking, rooms rearranging themselves according to logic I couldn't fathom. The hallway where this all began, or where I first noticed it beginning, remained the most unstable, sometimes stretching endlessly ahead of me, other times compressing until I could touch both walls simultaneously. The light switch that had started everything remained silent, no matter how many times I tested it. Walking through that hallway now, I understand that the silence was never about the switch itself, but about what the switch represented, the moment when familiar things stopped behaving as expected, when the reliable became unreliable. The carpet still whispers against my feet, but I've learned to listen more carefully to what it's trying to say. The window still stares back with its vacant stillness, but I recognize now that the vacancy isn't empty, it's waiting, just as it always was, just as I am still waiting. My fingers find the switch again, seeking that familiar click that never comes, but perhaps the sound was never the point. Perhaps what I've been searching for isn't the return of something lost, but the recognition of something that was always there, patient and persistent, like water wearing away stone, like memory wearing away certainty, like the slow understanding that some questions create their own answers simply by being asked. Story 7. Rain tapped softly against the window as the hotel room settled into the evening's routine hush. The dull hum of fluorescent lights filled the space, yet the air felt strangely thick. The curtains, partially drawn, allowed a sliver of dim light to highlight the meticulously arranged coffee table. Everything was in perfect order except for one peculiar detail. The second guest robe lay crumpled on the floor, its tie trailing eerily towards the slightly ajar bathroom door. An unsettling stillness hovered, suggesting that something was amiss, lingering just beyond the threshold of perception. I stood there, my fingers still gripping the plastic key card, watching the fabric breathe slightly in the artificial breeze from the heating unit. The robe shouldn't have been there. I remembered hanging both robes carefully on the bathroom door hooks before leaving that morning, a habit drilled into me by countless business trips. Yet here one lay, abandoned, as if someone had shed it in haste. The scent in the room was wrong too. Beneath the standard hotel cocktail of industrial detergent and synthetic vanilla, something else lingered. Something metallic and sharp, like the taste that floods your mouth when you bite your tongue. I breathed deeper, trying to place it, but the smell seemed to retreat, playing hide and seek with my senses. My colleague had been here when I left. We'd shared coffee at that pristine table, discussing the merger details that had brought us to this unremarkable city. She'd worn the hotel robe over her business attire, claiming the room's air conditioning was too aggressive. Her laugh had filled the space as she mocked the corporate speak in our presentation notes. That laugh now felt like an echo from another lifetime. I approached the bathroom door, my footsteps muffled by the industrial carpeting. The silence was absolute except for my own breathing and the persistent rain outside. Through the crack in the door, I could see a slice of white tile gleaming under the harsh bathroom lighting that I didn't remember leaving on. The door opened with the faintest whisper. Inside, everything appeared normal. Towels hung straight on their bars. The mirror reflected my own uncertain face back at me. The shower curtain was drawn closed, its plastic surface dotted with condensation that suggested recent use. But the air here carried that same metallic tang, stronger now, mixing with the humid warmth that bathrooms hold long after hot water has run. I pulled the shower curtain aside with one swift motion, my heart hammering against my ribs, empty. Just the standard white tub with its non-slip decals and the single-serve bottles of shampoo we'd never used. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by embarrassment at my own paranoia. Walking back into the main room, I noticed my phone blinking on the nightstand. 3 missed calls, all from the same number, her number. I pressed play on the first voicemail, and her voice filled the room, distant and hollow through the phone's tiny speaker. "Hey, it's me. I had to step out for a bit. Something came up. I'll explain when I get back." The timestamp showed she'd called just after I'd left for my afternoon meetings, but there was something in her voice, a tightness I'd never heard before. In the background, I could make out what sounded like traffic or maybe running water. The second message was shorter. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding. I need you to trust me on this. Don't talk to anyone about our conversation this morning, about what I told you." I replayed it twice, trying to remember what conversation she meant. We discussed the merger, the weather, her divorce proceedings. Nothing that seemed worth this level of urgency. The third message was barely audible, as if she were whispering or speaking from a great distance. "I'm sorry, I never meant for you to get involved." My hands trembled as I set the phone down. Involved in what? I sank into the room's single armchair, its scratchy upholstery rough against my palms. The coffee cup still sat on the table, hers lipstick stained and half empty, mine drained to the dregs. The sugar packets she'd torn open were still scattered beside her cup, though I distinctly remembered her drinking it black. The rain had intensified, drumming against the window with increasing urgency. I found myself staring at that crumpled robe, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events that could have led to its abandonment. Had she changed clothes quickly? Had someone else been here? The questions multiplied like fractals, each spawning new uncertainties. I decided to call the front desk. The phone rang 4 times before a tired voice answered. "Front desk. This is room Fort 12. I'm wondering if you've seen my colleague today. She would have left the hotel sometime this afternoon. A pause, paper rustling. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't have any record of anyone else registered to that room. She's not registered, she was visiting. About my height, dark hair, wearing a business suit. I've been on shift since noon, sir. I haven't seen anyone matching that description. The line went quiet except for the soft static of the connection. I thanked him and hung up, but his words echoed in my mind. How could he not have seen her? The lobby was small, intimate. Everyone who entered had to pass directly by the front desk. I began searching the room more systematically. In the wastebasket, I found a crumpled piece of hotel stationery with her handwriting. The ink was smeared as if it had gotten wet, but I could make out fragments. Can't go back, and they know about the files and something that might have been trust no one. My memory of our morning conversation began to shift and blur. Had she really been discussing the merger, or had there been something else, something I'd dismissed or forgotten? I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to force clarity, but the harder I concentrated, the more elusive the memories became. The heating unit cycled off, plunging the room into a deeper quiet. In the new silence, I became aware of a sound I hadn't noticed before, a rhythmic tapping that wasn't the rain. It seemed to be coming from the wall adjoining the next room. Tap, 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 a pattern that repeated every few seconds like a coded message or a desperate signal. I pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping stopped immediately, as if whoever was making it had sensed my attention. I waited, barely breathing, but it didn't resume. Instead, I heard what might have been footsteps or the creaking of old building materials settling in the dampness. The phone rang, sharp and sudden in the quiet room. I lunged for it, hoping to hear her voice again. Hello. Silence, not dead air, but the kind of loaded quiet that suggests someone listening, breathing, waiting. Hello, is someone there? A click, then the dial tone. I stared at the receiver, my reflection distorted in its black plastic surface. The caller ID showed only unknown number. I began to pace, wearing a path in the carpet between the window and the door. Each time I passed the bathroom, I glanced inside, half expecting to find something I'd missed. The fluorescent light flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows that made the space seem to shift and breathe. My laptop sat open on the desk, its screen dark. I touched the trackpad and it came to life, showing the last document I'd been working on. But there in the recently opened files was something I didn't remember accessing, a folder labeled Insurance Claims. I clicked it open and found dozens of documents, police reports, witness statements, all related to cases I'd never heard of. The dates were recent. The cases involved missing persons, unexplained disappearances, people who'd vanished from hotels just like this one. My hands moved across the keyboard without conscious direction, opening file after file. In each case, the missing person had been traveling on business, staying alone, last seen by colleagues who later claimed no memory of the encounter. One report made my blood freeze. A woman matching her description, reported missing from a hotel 3 cities away. The photograph was grainy, but the resemblance was unmistakable. According to the report, she'd been traveling with a business partner who claimed she'd never existed. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. This couldn't be real. I knew her. We'd worked together for months. I had emails from her, meeting notes in her handwriting, shared meals and conversations. She existed. She had to exist. But as I tried to recall specific details about her life, they seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. Where did she live? What was her background? The more I reached for concrete facts, the more they dissolved into vague impressions and half-remembered fragments. The tapping resumed from the adjoining room, more urgent now. I grabbed a glass from the bathroom and pressed it against the wall, trying to amplify the sound. Through the glass, I could hear voices, muffled and indistinct. One sounded like hers. I left the room and walked down the hallway to the next door. The number was 414. I knocked softly. "Excuse me, is everything all right in there?" The voices stopped immediately. I waited, then knocked again, harder. "Hello, I'm staying next door," I heard. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a security chain and a slice of a man's face. His eye was bloodshot, his skin pale and drawn. "You've got the wrong room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard voices, I thought maybe. "You didn't hear anything." His eye fixed on mine with an intensity that made me step back. "Go back to your room. Forget what you think you heard." The door closed with a soft click. I stood in the hallway, listening to my own breathing and the distant hum of the ice machine. The carpet beneath my feet was worn thin, and I noticed for the first time that it was stained in several places with dark spots that could have been anything. Back in my room, I sat on the bed and tried to think rationally. Perhaps she'd had to leave suddenly for a family emergency. Perhaps the files on my computer were research for a case I'd forgotten about. Perhaps my memory was playing tricks on me, stress and fatigue combining to create paranoid fantasies. But the robe still lay crumpled on the floor, and that metallic smell still hung in the air, and the rain still tapped its relentless rhythm against the glass. I picked up the robe and held it to my face. It smelled like her perfume, faint but unmistakable. The fabric was slightly damp, as if it had been worn recently. In one of the pockets, my fingers found something small and hard, a hotel key card, not mine. The magnetic strip was scratched and worn, but the room number was still visible, 414. My hands shook as I held the card up to the light. How had she gotten a key to the adjoining room? Why had the man at the door lied about being alone? The phone rang again. This time I let it ring twice before answering, trying to steady my voice. "Hello. You need to stop asking questions." The voice was unfamiliar, electronically distorted, neither male nor female. "Some things are better left alone." "Who is this? What happened to?" "She never existed. You never met her. Go home and forget." The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone until it became unbearable. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than sound. I looked around the room one final time. The coffee cups, the scattered sugar packets, the key card in my palm. Evidence of something, but evidence of what? Had I been part of something terrible, or was I losing my grip on reality? The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song, and somewhere in the walls of the building, pipes gurgled with the flow of water. I packed my belongings methodically, leaving everything exactly as I'd found it except for the robe, which I folded carefully and placed on the bed. At the door, I turned back for one last look. The room seemed to exhale in my absence, settling into the kind of anonymous quiet that hotel rooms specialize in. By morning, housekeeping would clean away any trace of what had happened here, whatever that might have been. I walked down the hallway past room 414. No light showed under the door, no sound emerged from within. It was as if the room had been abandoned, or perhaps had never been occupied at all. In the lobby, the desk clerk looked up as I approached. It was a different person than I'd spoken to on the phone, younger, with tired eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Checking out of Fort Welve," I said, placing my key card on the counter. He typed something into his computer, frowned, typed again. "I'm sorry, sir, but our records show that room has been vacant for the past 3 days." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. When it didn't come, I simply turned and walked away, leaving the key card on the marble counter where it caught the lobby's artificial light and gleamed like a small, flat mirror. The automatic doors whispered open, releasing me into the cool night air. Behind me, the hotel stood like a monument to temporary lives and forgotten encounters, its windows glowing with the warm light of other people's stories. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the building in my rearview mirror. In one of the fourth-floor windows, a shadow moved across the curtains. It could have been anyone or no one at all. The engine started with a reassuring rumble, and I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the empty street. In the distance, storm clouds gathered for another round of rain, and I drove toward them, carrying with me the weight of questions that would never find their answers, and the lingering scent of a perfume that might never have existed at all. Story 8. The latch clicked as I eased the door shut behind me. A faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air, its origin elusive. My fingertips tingled, a sensation that spread up my arm as if I had touched something forbidden. The room was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that presses on you, demands to be filled. I should have felt alone, but the stillness seemed to move, a whisper of presence brushing past. It wasn't until I reached for the light switch that I noticed the pulse of the room had shifted. I knew exactly what had happened in this room. The evidence was clear, methodical, undeniable. She had come here willingly, drawn by the same magnetic pull that brought us all to this place eventually. The arrangement of furniture told the story perfectly: the overturned chair, the scattered papers, the way the curtains hung askew as if disturbed by sudden movement. It was textbook, really. A moment of passion that escalated beyond anyone's control. The investigating officers had pieced it together within hours. She had arrived sometime after the evening shift change, when the building was nearly empty. Security footage showed her entering through the main entrance, her movements purposeful, determined. She knew where she was going. The keycard logs confirmed she had accessed this particular room at exactly the right time. Everything aligned with mathematical precision. The physical evidence supported the obvious conclusion. The broken glass near the window, the displaced items on the desk, the way the carpet showed clear signs of struggle, it all painted a vivid picture of those final moments. The medical examiner's preliminary findings were consistent with what anyone could see just by looking at the scene. This wasn't a mystery. It was simply a tragedy that had unfolded exactly as these things usually do. I had studied enough cases to recognize the pattern. The victim profile fit perfectly, isolated under pressure, carrying secrets that had become too heavy to bear. The location made sense: too familiar territory where she felt safe enough to let her guard down. The timing aligned with everything we knew about her state of mind in those final weeks. Every detail supported the narrative that had formed so naturally in everyone's minds. But standing here now, breathing in that strange metallic scent, something felt wrong. The tingling in my fingertips hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified, spreading through my hands like an electrical current. I found myself studying the room more carefully, and details began to emerge that didn't quite fit the neat story we had constructed. The overturned chair, for instance. It was positioned at an odd angle, not where you would expect it to fall if someone had simply knocked it over during a struggle. The papers scattered across the floor weren't random either, they seemed to form a pattern, as if they had been arranged deliberately. And the curtains, which I had initially assumed were disturbed by the commotion, hung in a way that actually blocked the view from the one window where someone might have seen inside. I walked to the desk where most of the disturbance had occurred. The surface was covered with a thin layer of dust, except for several clean rectangles where objects had been recently moved or removed. But here's what bothered me. The dust patterns didn't match the story of a spontaneous struggle. They suggested someone had carefully repositioned items, then created the appearance of chaos afterward. The broken glass caught my attention next. The fragments were scattered in a peculiar pattern, most of them concentrated near the wall rather than directly below the window where they should have fallen. I knelt down and examined them more closely. The way they had shattered and the direction of the scatter suggested the glass had been broken from outside the room, not from within. My certainty began to waver as I noticed other inconsistencies. The security footage that had seemed so conclusive now felt incomplete. It showed her entering the building, yes, but there were gaps in the coverage, blind spots where someone else could have entered undetected. The keycard logs that had seemed so definitive only told us when the door was accessed, not by whom. Anyone with the right access could have used her card after she arrived. I found myself questioning the medical examiner's findings too. The preliminary report had been rushed, completed under pressure to provide quick answers to anxious administrators. But preliminary reports were often wrong, and this one was based on a cursory examination of the scene rather than a thorough investigation. What if the obvious explanation wasn't the correct one? The victim profile that had seemed so clear-cut also began to crumble under scrutiny. Yes, she had been under pressure, but she had been handling it well. Her recent behavior hadn't suggested someone on the edge of a breakdown. If anything, she had seemed more focused and determined than usual in the weeks leading up to this incident. The secrets she supposedly carried might not have been burdens at all, but discoveries that someone else wanted to keep hidden. I walked back to the window and examined the curtains more closely. The fabric showed signs of recent handling, fingerprint smudges on the material that suggested someone had deliberately adjusted their position. But why would she have bothered to close the curtains if she had come here for the reasons we assumed, unless someone else had wanted to ensure privacy for what was about to happen? The metallic scent that had greeted me when I first entered the room was stronger near the window. I followed it, trying to identify its source. It wasn't the smell of blood as I had initially suspected, but something else entirely. Something chemical, artificial. The kind of scent that might linger after someone had used cleaning supplies to remove evidence of what had really occurred here. As I continued my examination, the room began to feel different. The silence that had seemed so oppressive when I first entered now felt expectant, as if it were holding secrets that wanted to be discovered. The shadows in the corners appeared deeper, more complex. Even the way the light fell through the adjusted curtains created patterns that seemed almost intentional. I started to consider alternative scenarios. What if she hadn't come here willingly, but had been lured? What if the keycard logs had been manipulated to create a false timeline? What if the physical evidence had been staged to support a predetermined conclusion? The more I thought about it, the more possible it seemed that someone had very carefully constructed the scene to tell a specific story. But who would have had the knowledge and access necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate deception? And why would they have chosen this particular victim? The answers to these questions led me down paths I hadn't expected to explore, toward people I had trusted and assumptions I had never thought to question. I realized that my own presence in this room wasn't entirely innocent either. I had been assigned to this case for specific reasons, chosen because my conclusions would carry weight with the investigation team. But what if my selection hadn't been random? What if someone had known exactly how I would interpret the evidence, had counted on my tendency to accept the obvious explanation? The tingling in my fingertips had spread throughout my body now, a constant reminder that something fundamental was wrong with everything I thought I knew. I found myself questioning not just the evidence in this room, but my own memories of how I had come to be here. The details that had seemed so clear were becoming fuzzy around the edges, malleable. Had I really been assigned to this case, or had I inserted myself into it? Were my memories of the initial briefing accurate, or had I constructed them to justify my involvement? The more I tried to pin down the specifics of how I had learned about this incident, the more elusive they became. I looked around the room one more time, and now everything appeared different. The overturned chair might not have been evidence of a struggle, but a signal. The scattered papers could have been a message rather than the result of chaos. The broken glass might have been a warning that someone had ignored. Even my own presence here felt like part of a larger pattern that I was only beginning to understand. The metallic scent was fading now, or perhaps I was becoming accustomed to it. But as it dissipated, other smells emerged, traces of perfume that didn't belong to the victim, the lingering odor of cigarettes in a building where smoking was prohibited, something sweet and cloying that might have been used to mask other scents. I realized that I might not be the investigator in this situation. I might be another piece of evidence placed here to serve someone else's purpose. The door I had entered through might not lead to the exit I expected. The case I thought I was solving might actually be solving me. Standing in that quiet room, surrounded by evidence that no longer meant what I had thought it meant, I understood that the truth was much more complex than I had imagined. The victim might not have been the victim, the crime might not have been the crime, and I might not be who I thought I was. The silence pressed against me again, but now it felt different. Not empty, but full of possibilities I hadn't considered. The room held its secrets close, and I was beginning to suspect that I was one of them. Story 9. I found myself absorbed in the quiet breath of the room, my eyes drawn to the unmoving ceiling fan above. Its blade seemed caught mid-turn, as if deciding whether to spin faster or come to a rest. The walls exhaled a subtle, almost imperceptible creak, a whisper lost to time. I felt the air shift, not with motion, but with intent, its presence pressing gently against my skin. It was the absence of a familiar sound, the hum that should have been, that held me captive. Then all at once the hum started, resonating softly through the air, bringing with it the weight of something unseen. That was the moment I knew she was gone, not the dramatic discovery you might expect, no screaming or frantic searching. Just the mechanical whir of the fan finally deciding to move, and the certainty settling into my chest like cold water. My sister had been staying with me for 3 weeks, recovering from what she called a rough patch. The kind of vague description that covered everything from job loss to heartbreak to something darker she couldn't name. The logical sequence of events plays out clearly in my memory. She'd been restless the night before, pacing the hardwood floors until well past midnight. I'd heard her footsteps through the thin walls, the soft padding of bare feet moving from the guest room to the kitchen, then back again. In the morning I found a note on the counter, her familiar handwriting sprawling across a torn piece of notebook paper. Need some space to think, don't worry, back soon. The coffee maker was still warm, suggesting she'd left around dawn. Her duffel bag was gone, along with her favorite jacket and the worn sneakers she'd kicked off by the door every evening. It made perfect sense. She'd done this before, disappearing for days when life pressed too hard against her. Our mother used to call it her vanishing act, spoken with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned not to panic at the first sign of absence. I spent that first day cleaning, folding the sheets she'd slept on, finding small traces of her presence. A hair tie on the bathroom counter, a book marked with a grocery receipt, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the guest room's stale air. But something felt wrong with the coffee maker. I stood there staring at it, my hand hovering over the warm glass carafe. She hated coffee, had always preferred tea, the kind that came in small boxes with exotic names and required precise steeping times. I bought a whole collection for her visit, arranged them in a neat wooden box on the counter. The box sat untouched, a thin layer of dust already settling on its surface. The wrongness started small, like a splinter working its way deeper under skin. I found myself returning to the kitchen throughout the day, staring at that coffee maker, trying to remember if I'd heard her moving around that morning. The house had been silent when I woke, the kind of deep quiet that suggested I was alone. But the note was there, and the missing bag, and the logical explanation that fit all the visible evidence. That night I dreamed of water, not the ocean or a lake, but the specific sound of water running through old pipes, the kind of persistent drip that echoes in empty spaces. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and a strange certainty that she hadn't written that note, not because the handwriting was wrong, but because of what it didn't say. She always signed her name, even on grocery lists, always added some small joke or observation that made me smile. This note felt hollow, like words arranged by someone who knew her habits but not her voice. The police were polite but unhelpful. Adults could disappear if they wanted to, especially adults with a history of taking impromptu trips. They took down her description, asked about recent stressors, suggested I wait a few more days before filing a formal missing person report. The officer who came to the house was young, probably newer to the job than my sister was to her pattern of vanishing. He walked through the rooms with professional detachment, noting the made bed, the missing personal items, the absence of any signs of struggle. But he didn't notice the window in the guest room, the one that stuck so badly I'd warned her about it on her first night. "Don't try to open that one," I'd said, pointing to the painted-shut frame. "It hasn't budged in years." Yet when I checked that morning, the paint seal was broken and the window slid open with surprising ease. Fresh air drifted in, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something metallic that made my stomach clench. I started finding things in places they shouldn't be. Her favorite mug in the dishwasher, though I remembered washing it by hand the night she arrived because she'd mentioned it reminded her of our grandmother. A single earring under the couch cushions, though she'd been wearing both when she said goodnight. Small inconsistencies that could be explained by forgetfulness or coincidence, but they accumulated like static electricity, building towards something I couldn't name. The neighbor across the street mentioned seeing someone in my backyard around dawn, moving near the old tool shed. "Probably just you," she said, squinting through her kitchen window as she recounted the memory. Though they seemed taller somehow, maybe it was the shadows. I hadn't been outside that morning, hadn't been anywhere near the shed, which I kept locked because the previous owner had left it full of rusted equipment and broken garden tools. The key was still in my kitchen drawer, exactly where I'd placed it months ago. But when I walked out to check the shed, my feet seemed to know the path too well, as if I'd made this trip recently. The door swung open without resistance, revealing a space that should have been cluttered and forgotten. Instead, everything had been moved, rearranged with careful precision. Tools hung on hooks, boxes stacked in neat rows. The concrete floor had been swept clean, though I caught the faint outline of something that might have been drag marks, or might have been shadows cast by the afternoon sun. That's when the second version started bleeding through, arriving in fragments that felt more like recovered memories than new thoughts. I saw myself waking not to silence, but to the sound of arguing voices. Saw my sister not packing calmly, but backing toward the guest room door with fear in her eyes. Saw my own hands, though they felt disconnected from my body, reaching for something heavy and unforgiving. The sensation came with physical memory, the weight of metal in my palms, the vibration traveling up my arms, the moment of impact that seemed to echo through my bones. But that couldn't be right. I'd slept through the night, woken to find her gone. The note was proof, the missing bag was proof, the logical sequence of events that explained her absence without requiring anything darker. I called her phone repeatedly, listening to the same voicemail message until her voice started to sound foreign, like someone imitating her speech patterns. On the fourth day, the calls went straight to a recording, saying the number was no longer in service. When I contacted the phone company, they told me the account had been canceled that morning, the request submitted online using her password and personal information. But she'd never been good with technology. I'd helped her set up that phone account, written down the password because she was afraid she'd forget it. The piece of paper was still tucked into her wallet, which I found buried at the bottom of her duffel bag. The bag I'd been certain was missing, though now it sat in the guest room closet as if it had never moved. The dreams became more vivid, more insistent. I saw the shed not as I'd found it, but as it had been before, cluttered and neglected. Saw myself working through the night, moving boxes and hanging tools, creating order from chaos. Saw the careful way I'd swept the floor, paying special attention to certain areas where the concrete seemed darker than the rest. During the day, I maintained the story that made sense. She'd left voluntarily, taking only what she needed for a short trip. The note explained everything, even if it felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. She'd done this before, would probably do it again. Some people needed space to breathe, needed the freedom to disappear without explanation or timeline. But at night, lying in bed with the ceiling fan spinning overhead, I felt the weight of a different truth pressing against my consciousness. The truth where her fear had been real, where the argument had escalated beyond words, where my own capacity for harm had surprised me as much as it had terrified her. The truth where the shed held more than rearranged tools, where the broken window seal told a story about desperation rather than departure. I started avoiding the guest room, then the kitchen, then eventually most of the house. The spaces felt contaminated by competing versions of reality, each room holding evidence for both stories. The made bed that suggested careful departure or careful staging. The missing clothes that indicated packing or disposal. The coffee maker that proved she'd been there that morning or proved someone wanted me to think she had been. The phone calls from our mother started a week later. Had I heard from her? Was she still staying with me? The questions felt like accusations, though her voice carried only maternal concern. I found myself describing the note, the missing bag, the familiar pattern of temporary disappearance. The words came easily, as if I'd been practicing them. But underneath the explanation, I felt something else. The memory of digging, of the satisfying way a shovel cuts through soft earth, of the careful measurements required to ensure something stays buried. Yet the shovel in the shed showed no signs of recent use. The ground around the property remained undisturbed, covered with the same weeds and fallen leaves that had been there for months. Physical evidence supported the departure theory, even as my body retained sense memories that suggested otherwise. The ache in my shoulders that spoke of heavy lifting. The dirt under my fingernails that I couldn't remember acquiring. The exhaustion that felt like the aftermath of physical labor rather than emotional stress. I hired a private investigator thinking that action might resolve the contradiction. If she'd left voluntarily, there would be a trail, credit card transactions, security footage, witness sightings. If something else had happened, the professional would find evidence I'd missed. But the investigator's report only deepened the mystery. No electronic footprint after that morning. No confirmed sightings despite her distinctive appearance. No trace of her passage through the world, as if she'd simply evaporated. The investigator suggested she might have been planning this disappearance for longer than I realized, might have prepared ways to travel and survive without leaving digital traces. It was possible, even probable given her history. But it was also possible that someone had been very careful about eliminating evidence, had planned each step to create exactly this kind of ambiguity. Standing in the shed now, months later, I still can't reconcile the two versions. The logical explanation that fits most of the facts, and the darker possibility that explains the inconsistencies. Both feel true and false simultaneously, like optical illusions that shift depending on where I focus my attention. The ceiling fan continues to spin overhead, its rhythm marking time that moves forward without resolution. Sometimes I think I hear her footsteps in the guest room, the familiar padding of bare feet against hardwood. Sometimes I smell her perfume in unexpected places, or catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that disappear when I turn to look. But I also remember the weight of the shovel, the sound it made cutting through earth, the careful way I'd measured distances and depths. I remember her eyes in that final moment, wide with understanding that came too late to change anything. I remember the satisfaction of a job completed, a problem solved, a loose end tied off with the kind of finality that only comes from burial. Which memory is real? Which version of myself can I trust? The brother who grieves for his missing sister, or the one who knows exactly where she is? The ceiling fan offers no answers, just the steady circulation of air that carries both possibilities forward into an uncertain future, where truth remains suspended like dust motes in afternoon sunlight, visible but never quite within reach. Story 10. I had just closed the window, a gust of cool air brushing against my skin one last time. The familiar creak of the wooden frame seemed softer now, almost apologetic. The room felt tighter, as if the air had thickened and pressed against me. My fingers traced the faint dust on the sill, a lingering memory of what had been let in. The sensation lingered, unsettling. As I turned to leave, the gentle hum that filled the space was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt too quiet, too deliberate. The dust on my fingertips was darker than it should have been, not the ordinary gray accumulation of neglect, but something with weight, with substance. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the grit dissolve into an oily residue that clung to my skin. The smell hit me then metallic, sharp, like pennies left too long in a pocket. I should have recognized it immediately, but the mind has ways of protecting itself from what it doesn't want to understand. Instead, I found myself staring at the window I had just sealed, wondering when I had opened it in the first place. The memory felt borrowed, as if I were recalling someone else's actions. The apartment belonged to my sister, had belonged to her. The distinction seemed important now, though I couldn't articulate why. She had been missing for several weeks, and I had volunteered to sort through her belongings while the investigation continued. The police had already been through everything, of course. They had taken photographs, collected evidence, asked their questions, but they had missed something. I was certain of it. The certainty itself was troubling. How could I know what trained investigators had overlooked? Yet the feeling persisted, a low hum of wrongness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I moved through the living room, cataloging details that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. The coffee table was positioned at an odd angle, as if someone had bumped into it while moving quickly through the space. A magazine lay open to an article about home security, though my sister had never expressed any concerns about safety. The bookmark protruding from a novel on the shelf marked a page much earlier than where she typically stopped reading. She was the type to finish books in single sittings, consuming stories with an intensity that sometimes worried me. These observations accumulated like sediment, each one insignificant alone, but collectively forming something dense and uncomfortable in my chest. I found myself breathing more deliberately, as if the air required conscious effort to process. The kitchen revealed more inconsistencies. A single plate in the sink, though she always washed dishes immediately after use. The refrigerator contained food that would have spoiled if she had planned to be away. Milk with a date that suggested she had expected to be home. Vegetables still crisp in their drawer. The mundane details of interrupted routine felt more ominous than any dramatic scene of struggle. I opened the refrigerator again, studying the arrangement of items. Something about their placement nagged at me. The condiments were organized differently than I remembered, not chaotically, but according to a logic that wasn't hers. She arranged things by frequency of use, keeping the most needed items at eye level. Now they were sorted by size, largest to smallest, with an almost obsessive precision. The discovery should have been significant, but instead it filled me with a strange lethargy. I closed the refrigerator door and leaned against it, feeling the mechanical hum vibrate through my spine. The sound was similar to what I had heard in the bedroom, that gentle, persistent background noise that had stopped when I closed the window. I returned to the bedroom, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The window remained shut, but now I noticed the curtains were drawn in a way that seemed deliberate, not fully closed, but arranged to create a specific pattern of light and shadow across the floor. The shadows formed shapes that reminded me of something, though the memory remained frustratingly elusive. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had brought me here. I remembered receiving the call from the detective, a woman with a voice that managed to be both professional and genuinely concerned. She had explained that my sister's disappearance showed no signs of foul play, but they were treating it as a missing person case nonetheless. The apartment had been secured and examined, and I was now free to collect any personal items I wanted to preserve. But I couldn't remember deciding to come here today specifically. The morning felt hazy, as if I had sleepwalked through the decision-making process. I had awakened with the intention already formed, the key to her apartment already in my hand, though I couldn't recall retrieving it from wherever I had stored it. The key itself was wrong. I examined it now, noting that it was newer than it should have been, the metal still bright and unscratched. My sister had lived here for years. Her key should have shown wear, should have carried the patina of daily use. This looked like a duplicate recently cut. I tested it in the lock, turning it slowly and listening to the mechanism respond. It worked perfectly, but the sound it made was different from what I expected, sharper, more precise, as if the lock itself had been recently serviced or replaced. The hallway outside her apartment was empty, but I could hear movement behind other doors. Muffled conversations, the scrape of furniture being moved, the distant sound of running water. Normal sounds of people living their lives, yet they seemed to carry an undercurrent of watchfulness, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I knocked on the door across from hers, driven by an impulse to connect these floating observations to something concrete. The woman who answered was elderly, with the careful posture of someone accustomed to being alone. Her eyes were sharp, though, and they studied me with an intensity that made me self-conscious. She knew who I was without introduction. She had seen me coming and going, she said, and had been expecting someone from the family to appear. Her voice carried a slight accent that I couldn't place, and she spoke with the measured cadence of someone choosing her words carefully. According to her, my sister had been acting strangely in the weeks before she disappeared, not obviously disturbed, but different in subtle ways. She had started keeping irregular hours, coming home at odd times and leaving again shortly after. There had been visitors, people the neighbor didn't recognize, who came during the day when most residents were at work. The description of these visitors was frustratingly vague. A man who wore expensive shoes but inexpensive clothes. A woman who always carried the same black bag and never stayed longer than a few minutes. Someone who knocked with a specific pattern, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones. I asked if she had mentioned these observations to the police. She had, of course, but they seemed to regard them as the typical hypervigilance of elderly neighbors. Nothing criminal, nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary circumstances. My sister was an adult, free to change her routines and receive whatever visitors she chose. The woman's manner suggested she had more to say, but was uncertain about sharing it. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable enough to fill. She had heard arguing, she finally admitted, not shouting, but the kind of intense, whispered conflict that carries through thin walls despite efforts at privacy. The voices were too muffled to understand words, but the emotional tenor was unmistakable fear, anger, desperation. The arguments always ended the same way, with the sound of the front door closing very quietly, as if someone was making a deliberate effort not to be heard leaving. The timing of these incidents was significant. They had occurred primarily during the day, when most people would assume the building was empty. Someone had been taking advantage of the privacy afforded by other residents' absence. I thanked the woman and returned to the apartment, but her information had shifted something in my perception. The space now felt less like my sister's home and more like a stage set arranged to suggest her presence while concealing evidence of other activities. I began searching more systematically, looking not for what was there but for what was missing. The absence of certain items became more telling than the presence of others. Her laptop was gone, though the power cord remained plugged into the wall. Her address book had disappeared, but the pen she always kept beside it still lay on the desk. Most significantly, the small wooden box where she kept important documents was missing, though the dust outline of its base remained visible on the shelf. These weren't the random selections of a burglar or the systematic removal of evidence by police. Someone had taken specific items while leaving others that should have been equally valuable or incriminating. The pattern suggested intimate knowledge of what was significant and what could safely be ignored. I found myself returning repeatedly to the bedroom window, drawn by the persistent feeling that it held some crucial piece of information. The view from the window showed the building's rear courtyard, a narrow space enclosed by brick walls and accessible only through the basement. It was the kind of area that would be invisible to casual observers, but perfectly visible to anyone positioned at this specific vantage point. The courtyard contained the building's dumpsters and a few storage units, but also something less obvious, a clear sightline to the rear entrance of the building across the alley. Someone standing at this window could monitor the comings and goings of residents in both buildings without being noticed. The realization brought with it a cascade of new questions. Had my sister been watching someone, or had someone been using her apartment to conduct surveillance? The distinction seemed crucial, but the evidence could support either interpretation. I noticed that the windowsill bore faint impressions, circular marks that could have been made by the base of binoculars or a camera lens resting against the surface for extended periods. The marks were subtle, visible only when the light hit them at the right angle, but they suggested sustained observation rather than casual glances. The apartment began to feel less like a home and more like an operational base. I moved through it again, this time looking for signs of systematic use rather than personal habitation. The kitchen showed evidence of minimal cooking, mostly prepared foods and simple meals that could be eaten quickly without creating mess or lingering odors. The living room was arranged to provide clear sightlines to multiple windows while keeping the occupant invisible from outside observation. Even the bathroom revealed telling details. The medicine cabinet contained basic supplies, but none of the personal items that accumulate over time. No prescription medications with her name, no specialized products that reflected individual needs or preferences. It was as if someone had stocked it to meet basic requirements without revealing anything about the actual user. The cumulative effect of these observations was deeply unsettling. Either my sister had been living a double life that I had never suspected, or someone else had been using her space for purposes she may not have fully understood. Both possibilities carried implications that I wasn't prepared to confront. I sat in her chair, the one piece of furniture that still felt genuinely hers, and tried to process what I had discovered. The chair bore the subtle impressions of long use, molded slightly to accommodate her specific posture and habits. It faced the window, but at an angle that allowed monitoring of both the courtyard and the street beyond. The positioning was too deliberate to be accidental, but too subtle to be immediately obvious. Someone had thought carefully about the optimal placement for observation while maintaining the appearance of ordinary furniture arrangement. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and seemingly innocuous, a wrong number inquiry about a dinner reservation. But something about the timing felt significant, as if my presence in the apartment had triggered some kind of alert. I looked around the space with new awareness, wondering if my activities were being monitored. The feeling of being watched was probably paranoia, but it was strong enough to change my behavior. I found myself moving more quietly, avoiding the windows, checking the door lock repeatedly. The paranoia might have been justified. As I prepared to leave, I noticed that several items had shifted slightly from their original positions. Not dramatically, but enough to be perceptible to someone who had been studying the space carefully. Either I had unconsciously moved things while searching, or someone else had been in the apartment while I was talking to the neighbor. The possibility that I was not alone in the building created a new layer of urgency. I gathered the few items that seemed genuinely personal: photographs, letters, a piece of jewelry that I remembered her wearing, and prepared to leave. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard the sound that had been haunting me since I arrived. The gentle hum was back, barely audible but definitely present. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a mechanical sound that suggested hidden activity. I followed it through the apartment, trying to locate its source, but it seemed to shift as I moved, always just beyond precise identification. The sound led me back to the bedroom, where it was strongest near the window I had closed. I opened the window again, and the hum immediately stopped, replaced by the ambient noise of the city beyond. But now I could see what I had missed before: a thin wire running along the window frame, so fine and carefully placed that it was nearly invisible. The wire disappeared into a small hole drilled in the window frame, connecting to something within the wall itself. I traced its path as far as I could without tools, but its ultimate destination remained hidden. What was clear was that the window served as more than just a vantage point for observation. It was part of a more sophisticated surveillance system. The implications were staggering. My sister's apartment had been converted into a monitoring station, equipped with technology that I was only beginning to understand. Whether she had been a willing participant or an unwitting victim was impossible to determine from the evidence available. I closed the window again, sealing whatever system I had temporarily disrupted. The silence that followed felt different now, not empty, but full of hidden activity. I had the sense of being a minor player in a much larger drama, one whose scope and purpose remained beyond my comprehension. As I left the apartment, I realized that I had answered none of my original questions and had instead discovered evidence of complexities I wasn't equipped to investigate. My sister's disappearance was connected to activities that extended far beyond her personal life, involving people and purposes that remained invisible to me. The key felt heavier in my hand as I locked the door behind me. I was no longer certain it was actually mine to use, or whether my presence in the apartment had been as authorized as I had believed. The detective's voice on the phone now seemed less like official permission and more like careful manipulation, guiding me to discover specific information while keeping me ignorant of the larger context. Walking away from the building, I could feel eyes on my back, whether real or imagined, I couldn't say. But the sensation was strong enough to make me vary my route home, taking turns that would reveal whether I was being followed while avoiding any predictable pattern of movement. The paranoia was probably excessive, but it felt like the only rational response to what I had discovered. I was now part of whatever web had ensnared my sister, connected to her fate in ways I was only beginning to understand. The dust on my fingertips had long since been washed away, but the metallic smell lingered in my memory, a reminder of questions that might be too dangerous to answer.